Heated Rivalry's astronomical raise to fame has also brought a huge number of new fans to hockey. Heated Rivalry has, of course, been one of the biggest scale romantic television shows that we have seen in a long time. But one of the side effects of this TV show was new fans coming to hockey. And while this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, hockey romances have been making new hockey fans for a very long time. I do think that the scale at which this is happening with Heated Rivalry is partially because of how genuinely good the hockey in this romance is. Hockey very much functions as almost a third character in both Shane and Ilya's relationship as well as Scott and Kip's. And we've spent the last 2 episodes of this series breaking down Shane and Ilya's relationship, the hockey context and what it means for their romance, and how understanding a little bit of the hockey that you may not have understood if you're not a hockey fan prior to going into this show really affects each part of their romance. And I did, of course, promise that we would go through the entire show chronologically and that the next episode would be about Scott and Kip's relationship. This is that episode, which has been heavily delayed because of the fact that I was covering the Olympics and that I actually went to the Olympics as well. But of course, the Winter Olympics were a huge part of the last episode we talked about in episode 2, and will of course factor into this episode, episode 3, as we talk about Scott and Kip. So while there was a little bit of a break in this series, I do want you to know it's because I was literally watching Olympic hockey. If you missed the first 2 episodes of this series, you can of course go back and get breakdowns of episode 1 and episode 2, and how the timeline between Shane and Ilya really illustrates how much of the timeline of their hockey careers are really wound up in their relationship. One of the big differences between Shane and Ilya's relationship and Scott and Kip's relationship is how much hockey timeline really factors in. As we went through the first 2 episodes and the beginning of Shane and Ilya's relationship, there was so much that had to do with what happens before you get into hockey. How their relationship really starts from hearing about each other as they're heading into the draft. How the International Prospect Cup, which is a stand-in for World Juniors in the real hockey world, starts with Shane and Ilya almost viewing each other as these mythological people they haven't met yet, and Shane really seeking that out. Then having them being pitted against each other from before they even meet on the ice. Hockey and Shane and Ilya's relationship functions in such an interesting way because it really also shows you the DNA of hockey itself. Their careers and their romance are completely intertwined from the very beginning. And while the thing that keeps them from being together officially is hockey and their careers, it's also the only reason they know each other and incredibly integral to their love story. And I think that that is where this conversation of like, it's not about hockey comes in. Part of the reason why this show and this romance, and objectively the books as well, are so good is because it is about hockey. To me, a really good hockey romance, or any sports romance in general, works because you understand that it has to happen with hockey. If you take this story and you put it in the NBA, or you take this story and you set it in the world of modeling or on a cruise ship, all of those settings and those jobs would not work in the same way to build this relationship. And that's why I think it sparked so much of an excitement around the world of hockey in general, whether you've started watching the NHL or the PWHL because of it. But one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk about Scott and Kip's relationship is that hockey still is a massive part of their relationship, but it is in such a different way. The characters and the dynamics that are set up by the creation of the characters by Rachel Reed, and of course Jacob Tierney's version of it in this television show, utilize hockey in 2 really different ways. So if you haven't watched the first 2 episodes of this series where we talk about Shane and Ilya and their relationship and how it forms, be sure to go back to those. But today we're diving into episode 3 and talking about Scott and Kip. Now, the thing that I really love about hockey and Scott and Kip together is that it's almost a direct opposition of what hockey is to the romance between Shane and Ilya. Shane and Ilya don't meet without hockey. They are a romance that wouldn't necessarily happen to 99% of the world. It requires you to be a professional athlete that is so good that you also have a rival who is either the first or second best player in the league. But when we talk about Scott and Kip's relationship, it actually focuses a lot more on a traditional romance trope. There's a standard meet cute at a smoothie shop, 2 people fall in love and try to build a relationship together. But instead of being the thing that brings them together like Shane and Ilya, hockey is the thing that essentially functions as a third person in their relationship in a very negative way. Hockey is objectively the thing that keeps them apart and the thing that causes their third act breakup. So let's go through this episode kind of chronologically and talk about how hockey kind of functions as the villain of their story. One of the things I actually really like about this episode is the previously on cut that comes before. When I was rewatching, I let it play even though I obviously remembered what happened, but the cut is essentially all of the moments of Scott kind of clocking Ilya and Shane's relationship, and I thought it was a really fun way to put all of it together. I personally hadn't read the books before I watched the TV show. I have now since read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game, and obviously have purchased Game Changer, but for this series I do really want to talk about the TV show on its own and how it functions if you didn't know anything from the books. And part of that is because when we talk about changing the medium a story is being told in, so going from a book series and going to a TV show instead, there are things that do change objectively and also different ways that you can tell a story. The previously on cut really highlights a number of moments in the first 2 episodes that set you up to be a part of Scott's story. Because essentially all of the scenes are just Scott talking to Shane and being like, I think there might be something there. We've got Where's Your Boy Rozanov at the MLH Awards. We also have, of course, him clocking him on the bench when we're at the All-Star game. And there are a couple of other moments where we just sort of see Scott watching Shane and clocking the fact that there's probably something going on there. And I think it actually sets us up to understand a lot about what it would be like to be Scott in this league. Not only is Scott very aware of who he is as a person and his sexuality, but he also would be a kind of number one person, number one star in this league prior to Shane and Ilya actually coming into the league. While I know in the books the difference in age between Scott and Shane and Ilya is not very significant, I think it's only a couple of years, in the show it does feel a little bit longer. And part of that I do think is important to understand because it does set up a sort of generational difference between them. The actors do have a bigger age difference between them, and I actually really like the idea of aging Scott up. Part of that is because in the first 2 episodes, we set up who Scott is in this league. And who he is someone that Shane and Ilya probably would have been aware of growing up and watching in the league. And now they're starting to play against him, as well as at the All-Star game in Shane's instance getting to play with him. As we see Scott kind of clock Shane and Ilya's relationship and the way that they're interacting with each other, or at the very least clocking how Shane interacts with other people and how he looks at Ilya, there is this interesting build of why Scott would have been so interested or so aware of it when it seems like nobody else is. And this sort of like previously on cut kind of brings all of that together. And of course, as you then jump into the episode, you very quickly learn why Scott may have been so aware of these things. We kick this episode off with Scott running in New York listening to a podcast that we hear frequently throughout this show, and that is the Man in the Crease podcast. This podcast functions throughout the show as a way to expertly dump a lot of hockey information that is relevant to the plot, but needs to get out there quickly and set the mood before we get into the plot of the romance. And I'm gonna be honest with you, Scott listening to a podcast while he runs down the street in New York that is actively ripping his career to shreds and also probably has been doing so for a while tells us a lot about his mindset as a competitor. First of all, being able to run to a podcast is such a crazy thing to me. I actually cannot imagine actively running my heart out at the top speed in the middle of the city, listening to 2 dudes talking about hockey. There's something very Shane Hollander coded about that. And not only is it 2 dudes talking about hockey, it's 2 dudes talking about how bad Scott is at hockey right now. To go through a couple of the things that they talk about in this podcast episode so that you understand the hockey context if you're not a big hockey fan, they're talking about Scott's declining performance in this season compared to last season. And they do give us a couple of numbers that are pretty relevant here. First and foremost, they say that last season, Scott scored 70 points, and that now 6 games into this season, which he apparently called a need-to-win season, he has exactly 0 points. Now, if you don't know what points are in hockey, when we're tracking how good a player is offensively, we're talking about their points. And those points are accumulation of both the goals that they've personally scored as well as the goals that they've assisted on. So generally speaking, you'll hear a point count for a player, but then you'll also hear that point count actually divided based off of goals and assists. Both of them are, of course, very important when it comes to playing a game and being a well-rounded player. And generally speaking, 0 points in 6 games for the captain of your team who is also an offensive player is not a great look. Scott is not just in a slump, he's very early into this season looking pretty terrible. They're only 6 games into this season, and a standard hockey season, when we're talking about the NHL, which is kind of mirroring the MLH here, is 82 games in a regular season. So 6 games in, which sounds like 6 losses in a row as well as 0 points scored, is not a great way to start your season, but importantly, there is certainly plenty of time for the Admirals to turn this season around if Scott and the rest of the team can get it together. And lucky for them, there's someone who makes really good smoothies that help you turn things around. The other things mentioned in this podcast episode are that his passes aren't connecting, they say he is barely skating, and in spite of all of that, he's already been named as the Team USA captain for the Olympics. Now, all of this is objectively pretty brutal. He's not only having a bad season, but the podcast itself is kind of breaking it down. And one thing I did kind of wish, like when we're talking about the realism of this world that's been created by the television show, is I think this podcast should be a lot meaner. I know this is a fantasy. I know we love our players. I know we love our characters, but the broadcast voice and tone of this podcast sometimes gets confusing when we're talking about if it's the game broadcast or if it's the podcast, but also just objectively, guys with hockey podcasts are not nice dudes. They're not sitting there talking about these players in like a really nice tone or kind of delivering brutal things in a broadcast tone. They are sitting there and absolutely ripping these guys to shreds. And while the dialogue is, I wouldn't say that the tone is in this podcast. And I kind of wish there was was just like someone, whether it's a girl or a guy, just absolutely ripping these people to shreds in the next season, because that is the way that hockey fans are. I do wish that our hockey podcast in this world just had like a little bit more grit to it, and maybe that's something we'll see in the future seasons as we're going through. Again, I know this is just sort of like a storytelling device to get hockey information out, but personally, I really want to see like a hockey podcast that is just absolutely devastated by the fact that Scott Hunter is never going to bring a cup back to New York. Obviously, these things change, and we do know that, and it's very pivotal that he does eventually get a cup. But the thing about it is, I do want to hear people talking about how it's ruining their lives. I literally just finished watching a Kings game and sent my friend a text that said, I hate this team and I hate this sport. And actually, there were a lot more expletives in it. Hockey fans don't care if you're having a bad day. They care that you're losing and making their day bad. But I digress. I do think that objectively, the thing that I took away from this is the idea of Scott being the type of competitor that is almost so self-deprecating and so self-flagellating that he would sit there and in his workout where he tries to get better, listen to people talk about how badly he's playing. There's something up there that really, I think, needs a little bit of love. And luckily, he gets some. So Scott decides he's had enough. He slows down, he rips the headphones out, and luckily he's standing right in front of a smoothie shop. This is our kind of objective meet cute, and I really enjoyed it. We already know as we were coming into this episode that Scott is the captain of the New York Admirals, that he's a hockey player, and we already know that this is kind of like a celebrity meeting a normal person. That is generally always a fun trope to go through. Scott orders his smoothie in a very charged scene, and while I won't break this down because I feel like this was one of the biggest things that people were talking about during the actual airing of the show, the consistency of it from a hockey perspective, if you put a banana in something, it gets thicker. It's okay. I do think, yeah, you know what? There's protein. Personally, I would have added maybe some peanut butter, some almond butter in it. There's got to be a thickening agent back there that somebody could have worked with, but that's all right. Maybe there's something even more beautiful in the fact that Scott was like hooked on an objectively ugly and horrible looking smoothie, because it's not even really juice. It's like a blend of, it should be a smoothie. Something was missing. Something wasn't frozen. Something wasn't added, but it's all right. I think the most important part about this scene when we're talking about hockey, we're talking about how this works in their relationship, is actually when Scott leaves. As soon as Scott leaves, we see kind of Kip being like, oh, I think I was just getting flirted with. What a hot customer. We see his coworker being like, girl, I think you were. And then we see a complete stranger walking into the smoothie shop who instantly recognizes Scott. Not only does he instantly recognize Scott, he's like so starstruck that he doesn't even remember to say, oh my God, you're Scott Hunter, and instead says it as soon as he comes in to Kip. Now, off the bat, this establishes Scott's fame that comes from sports that automatically gets rid of his ability to have any sort of anonymity at all. There is, of course, the moment in their meet cute where Kip himself does not recognize Scott and just sort of has a normal moment of flirting with Scott. And I think that there's something really appealing in that when you're talking about a celebrity level athlete who walks into a space where he thinks for the first time, nobody knows who I am. Especially when you're thinking about the fact that right now, everybody who knows who he is like, dude, can you learn how to play hockey? Scott is in this place where he's being absolutely brutally attacked for his abilities, where he can't seem to get his game going. And then for a moment of respite, comes in and sees Kip, who instantly doesn't know who he is. Just thinks he's a hot guy who might want a little bit more banana in his smoothie when we're talking about the way his run is going. But that moment is shattered by a normal fan recognizing him and wanting to talk about it instantly. And what I think is really good about this moment, this really small moment with basically a one-liner character, is that we've established Scott as this character who is a high-level celebrity and very important to the world of hockey, who's sort of an elder or a mentor when we're looking at Shane, who's clocking this kind of energy of a new young player coming in that might be like him, who doesn't have really any sense of normalcy in his life. And the moment that he meets Kip is that moment of normalcy, but it's instantly shattered and from then on can't happen again. So we establish who Scott is, his level of fame, the fact that Kip doesn't really know who he is or follow hockey much, and of course the fact that Scott's season is really going poorly. But what I really love that starts from here is this version of Kip that almost feels like an entry point for fans. Kip's journey at the very beginning almost feels a little bit like Heated Rivalry fans did. A ton of people who didn't watch hockey before Heated Rivalry started watching this show. They fell in love a little bit with these characters, and then they became very deeply and specifically interested in hockey as a concept. And you start to have this like high level of fangirl special interest in a sport. And that's sort of what happens with Kip here. We know that Kip has had an experience of being around hockey before, that his dad is a big Admirals fan, and that he's never even paid enough attention to recognize the captain of the team when he walks back into the store for the first time. But now that he has a specific connection with one specific hockey player, the boy is learning everything about hockey in 4 minutes. He's got the game on in the bar, he's bothering his friends, he's reading up the next morning on the game report, he's using terms like hat trick, and his friends are like, yeah, I was there, you watched the game, do you know what a hat trick is? I actually think that Kip's kind of version of a character here is such an interesting entry point in a space that we haven't had before. The first 2 episodes of the show are very much only characters that are a part of this hockey world. And instead, with episode 3, every part of the romance is stepping away from the hockey world and introducing a new character and side characters to that space. Kip becomes a sort of vessel for the fan of the show watching that doesn't necessarily know much about hockey, but that is now open to learning about this world because they care about a person in it. And of course, now that Scott has a new pregame routine that's going to work for him, we watch Scott be the one to bring home a win. And while there is absolutely no defense on that goal that he scores in the first period to tie it up, it is really fun to mirror Scott's sort of superstition and his ability to play with how his relationship with Kip is growing. And of course, we see Scott essentially say a lot of those things while he's talking to Kip. He comes back and Kip sort of reveals that he knows who Scott is. He says that he never really watches hockey, but he did watch the game last night, and he watched the playoffs with his dad last season, and that his dad is a huge Admirals fan. But now, one, I do think it's really funny that Kip managed to watch an entire series with his dad and obviously not pay enough attention to know who Scott Hunter is or remember his face, but I actually do love that. And the other thing that Kip bringing this up kind of sets up is the fact that not only would Scott be recognized on the street with Kip, not only would Scott be recognized at events with Kip, and not only do people in Kip's place of business remember Scott and recognize Scott, whether they're strangers or coworkers, Scott would literally be recognized in Kip's own home. And so as their relationship was building, as a fan of hockey, there was also a level of tension that was building, because everything that was being revealed, while it seemed really sweet, was also this moment where I was like, God, they're never going to be able to be together in public. Not only can they not be together in public, but Kip can't even really bring Scott home. It's not a situation where his roommate sort of is like, oh, I don't know who that guy is. It's a situation where his dad is a really big fan of this team. And of course, they both live in New York, meaning that Kip didn't move here. He's from New York. His family is from New York. His father is an Admirals fan from growing up here. And that becomes a very different level of commitment if Scott ever wanted to meet Kip's dad. Kip's dad is a fan who's probably not very happy with Scott's performance currently. And it also sets up the tension of why Kip might not want to go home very often in this episode. Because now he's having this really great relationship where he's so excited about who he's dating, and he can't tell his dad that it is literally the captain of his favorite hockey team. And it's something that I wanted to point out because I don't know if it would have connected if you weren't already a hockey fan. Kip is about to enter into a secret relationship with Scott, and he and his dad have a very close relationship. They still live together, they still talk to each other in a very positive and nice way, and it's a secret that Kip believes he has to keep from his dad, mostly because Scott says he has to in general. This is a relationship that definitely can't be public, and if Kip's dad has no idea that this is the relationship that he's in, but he's also a really big fan of the Admirals. Kip's dad is probably going to reference the performance of the Admirals and maybe say some things about Scott, maybe yell things about Scott at the television, maybe complain about the game, have friends over that might be watching the game, listen to a podcast called Man in the Crease that has a really big vendetta against Scott. There are so many little things that a hockey fan would be doing during the regular season, not realizing what those comments would mean to Kip. To Kip's dad, Kip suddenly just has this big interest in hockey, and he's super excited that sometimes his son wants to watch games with him. And also, especially as this is now a new interest that he was previously trying to get him into, it's probably something that he actively wants to talk about more frequently, trying to share this interest with him. And so from that little moment of us being told that they used to watch the playoffs together and that his dad is a huge fan, it also sets up a really specific piece of tension as to why this relationship will weigh on Kip as much as it does, and also why he starts to kind of self-isolate in such an extreme way. As we go through the episode, we'll talk about these moments where Kip kind of isn't going home, he isn't seeing his dad, he isn't sharing things with his dad, and all of that weight is specifically because of hockey in this relationship. And so again, I know I've said this in both of the episodes as we've covered episode 1 and 2, but this show is so good at these small moments that if you do watch hockey and understand hockey culture, really do a great service in these really small lines of giving you as a viewer really great context to what this relationship is and what it's going to turn into. And the tension is rising for some people thinking that Scott might be a serial killer, but for me or a hockey fan, really because you're like, oh my God, there is a train coming for you and you don't even know it yet. So after Kip kind of breaks the illusion that he doesn't know who Scott is, or kind of breaks that fantasy for Scott, I'm actually really glad that we do that so early on. One of the tropes that we do see in romances like this, where you have one character who's super famous or a professional athlete, is often that the kind of normal person love interest doesn't know who they are, and then that becomes this big secret that they have to reveal later. For Kip and Scott, it really only lasts for their first interaction, and then after that, we become very aware of Scott's fame. And I think that that's really important to understand the concept of how this hockey part of their relationship becomes such a big deal. Quickly after this, we sort of get into the idea of hockey superstitions, which I really love as a part of hockey culture coming into this, but also this idea that it kind of pushes their relationship relationship forward. Scott uses this idea of his game day routine where he finds something new that's working for him and he doesn't want to change a single thing, which gives him a really great excuse to keep coming back to the same smoothie shop and ordering the same smoothie from the same guy. There's something really fun about the way that they kind of use hockey and sports superstitions in general to actually build their relationship off of this common thread. Some of the kind of hockey superstitions that come up in this conversation are obviously routine and this smoothie, but we also get things like putting your socks on in the right order, which is something that Scott doesn't say is really important to him, but we later see kind of highlighted with his banana socks. And of course, we get the idea of playoff beards, which Kip then uses to kind of signal his interest in Scott, and it's the first time Scott is 100% sure that that's what's going on here. And these were little hockey moments that I actually really loved. You have Scott, who is a character whose entire life, as we find out throughout the episode, is completely wrapped around hockey. Not just in his career, but also in his upbringing with his parents being junior hockey coaches, and of course in the community that he found after he lost his parents. Hockey is so integral to this character in ways that we don't fully see until we get to the end of the episode, but that are completely coming through in a way that kind of everything he does is about hockey. And again, that's a theme that we see between our kind of three leading men in this show. Shane, Ilya, and Scott all have deep relationships with hockey, and it kind of forms their DNA in a very unique way. For Shane, hockey is the most important thing in the world, and it becomes a hyper-focus, and maybe, before Ilya, really the only thing that he truly loved for himself. Hockey for Shane is something that he fears losing, and that when he meets someone that he may love, it scares him because it's also something that could cause him to lose hockey. For Ilya, hockey is this kind of escape. It's an escape from the upbringing that he had, it's an escape from Russia, it's an escape from his family, and it's also a tether to his mother in some ways. But for Ilya, when he meets Shane, it's also something that objectively threatens his safety. Should there be a reason that he can't play hockey anymore, there's no way for him to stay out of Russia and to stay in a new home that he's built for himself. Hockey for Ilya represents something that he has built on his own, and it represents kind of the one space where he's truly himself and an individual. And his relationship with Shane could enhance that, but it could also take everything away. For Shane and Ilya and hockey in their relationship, it's very much about competition, and competition breeds their sort of connection. But for Scott, it's a little bit different. Scott's identity is wrapped up in hockey in a way that is completely different than Shane or Ilya's. Even though Shane's relationship with hockey has a lot to do with his family being supportive, and Ilya's relationship with hockey has a lot to do with his family being something that needs to be escaped, Scott's relationship with hockey is almost the only connection that he has to family that he's lost. And so what I really love about the way that this kind of relationship forms with Kip is that it does come from hockey, but it also represents a family that Scott could have outside of hockey. And the thing that I love about Scott and Kip's meet cute and kind of the building of their relationship is that it does bloom from this idea of Scott's hockey superstitions. It does kind of come from this obsession with getting better at something that he knows he's good at, and at an obsession with getting better at the one thing that still connects him to his parents. But from this moment in this conversation with hockey superstitions where Scott is now 100% sure that Kip is kind of interested, and it's just from this little comment about kind of playoff beards, it's where we get this sort of fork in the road. Because on one side, hockey has always represented the only version of family that Scott has had in his life. But now, as he starts to kind of focus on this post-game smoothie and winning again, Kip starts to present this idea of a family he could have that doesn't have anything to do with hockey at all. And that is sort of like the divergence that I think we get here that is really cool and really smart when it comes to their relationship. However, as Scott tries to have both realities, so to speak, hockey becomes the thing that also starts to suffocate their relationship. Also, if you didn't know about playoff beards, they are a tradition in hockey, which is that usually as we enter the Stanley Cup playoffs and we run towards the finals to win the cup, hockey players will not shave until they are knocked out of the playoffs or until they hoist that cup in the air. It is a really fun superstition that I enjoy that I don't think has anything to do with players having CTE, but I also thought there was something really fun in that being the sort of flirtatious moment that Kip is able to signal to Scott that is what he's looking for. And it's this little thing that does kind of test the boundaries, and then Scott is able to quietly make a move. Scott gives Kip his tickets to his home game, which at this point I will say this was one thing when they were sitting in the seats that I was shocked it didn't turn into like a gossip moment, because usually, to my understanding, again, I've never been a wag, but I do think that there are generally sort of like family sections when it comes to hockey. Usually there's an area in the stadium where the home team does have their reserve seats that they're able to give to friends and family. And so luckily for Kip and Elena, they're sitting together, so maybe it would not have been as big of a flag. But also it seems like when we see them and they're watching warm-ups, obviously the stadium is pretty empty and they're able to sort of slip in and no one notices. But I did kind of want like a wag group chat moment where we were like, wait, who is this guy? This smoothie barista and girl? Like, I kind kind of thought there would be rumors of Elena dating Scott to some degree, just because they're sitting in those friends and family seats. But again, this is something that's not really necessary. It's something that I did think would be kind of funny, just kind of showing that sort of hockey culture. But we get a little bit of that with Jackie, and also seeing Shane and the way that he interacts with the Montreal Metros throughout the season. However, they do sort of harp on how good the seats are, and Kip is like, yeah, obviously they're literally his seats. And so I just thought it was funny that we never get any rumors of like Elena and Scott, because you have Scott waving at Elena and Kip and they both wave back, and it's actually a pretty good cover, and maybe this is something that they would have just cut for time. But I do think it's possible that you would have seen at least a couple of like gossip tweets about who this girl was waving at Scott from the ice. Anyway, as we move forward, we also start to talk about this idea of timeline. So many people with this episode harp on how fast Scott and Kip move, and objectively, this episode is only 4 months long. Their entire relationship from this episode, from the moment that they meet until Scott is looking into the birthday party at the very end of the episode, is supposedly 4 months, because we get that title card at the very beginning. And that is pretty quick for someone to essentially move into someone else's home and become basically like a live-in boyfriend for a long period of time. However, I also think that hockey as itself is a part of the reason why this is going on. We've established very quickly how famous Scott is, how quickly his life is moving, how often he's on the road, and also how aware people are of who Scott is. And as Kip goes through his relationships with his friends and family, we're often seeing the fact that he has to hold back, he has to lie, he has to kind of keep this a secret. And we see Scott try multiple times to actually go on public dates with Kip, but we also see those things instantly thwarted by the fact that he would be recognized. The first time that they actually go on like a proper date, which is the 4th time that they actually see each other, Kip is working at that fundraiser and Scott asks him to go to dinner afterwards. But as soon as they get to the restaurant, it's really crowded and you see Scott sort of duck his head. And again, it's a reminder that Scott is like wanting to live a different life, but also very aware of the expectations that hockey puts on him. So throughout the progression of the episode, it does make sense to me that their relationship does get pretty intense, because they're always only going to be able to be with each other in a private space. And also it makes sense that Kip becomes more and more isolated because he can't share the details of maybe the most exciting thing happening to him right now with his friends and family in a real meaningful way. And again, I kept getting reminded of the fact that Kip's dad is so aware of hockey and such a big Admirals fan. And we get a really clear sign that Kip is actually very close with his dad. And I have to imagine that it's hard enough to lie to his dad about what's going on and about something that he objectively probably wants to share with him, but it would be even harder to do it in person. And so as we go through all these moments that we'll talk through really quickly with the hockey context, I think hockey becomes this kind of looming situation that not only makes their relationship move faster because it has to be a private relationship, but also makes things move faster and in a more intense way because of the fact that Kip can't share things with the people he normally would share them with. The only person he can really talk to about his relationship with Scott is Scott. And the only person he can kind of share things with is Elena, and that's because she was already pretty aware of it. So I think hockey as something that's forcing them to keep their relationship a secret, and also something that forces Scott's schedule to be as intense as it is, given the fact that he's traveling, he's playing, he's got practice all the time, he's going to constantly be going somewhere. All of that sort of creates this environment where obviously things are going to go very intensely, very quickly. So also a couple of things that we learn about kind of the hockey side of things and about Scott through this episode, just from like the hockey scenes that we see on screen. Scott plays right wing, which is different from the position that Shane and Ilya play. Shane and Ilya both play center. And basically when you look at a hockey team, there are 3 forwards or 3 offensive players. Those are your left wing, your right wing, and your center. Scott playing right wing actually is kind of interesting and also makes a little bit of sense when we talk about the All-Star game that we saw him in previously. Shane playing center and Scott playing right wing means that they could have played on the same line, which would have been fun to see. But also it just means that Scott is going to be playing a pretty offensive game and still would have been able to be a pretty big star on the team. A few other things that you'll see that are hockey related if you're looking at sort of the graphics during the hockey games in this episode. Underneath the score on the games, you'll always see sort of a little smaller number that's usually higher than the score. And those are called shots on goal, which means how many successful shots on goal that they had versus how many goals they had. So there's one game where we see that San Francisco has 1 goal with 6 shots on goal. New York has 2 goals with 5 shots on goal. That just means that San Francisco made 6 official attempts and only made 1 goal, whereas New York made 6 official attempts and had 2 goals go in. There are a couple of times where we see things not necessarily add up, but again, not a big deal, very background information here. But different things that I think are interesting, you'll see stats like time on ice, which means how much time that player has physically been on the ice during the game. Hockey is played in 3 20-minute periods, and throughout those 20-minute periods, we play what's called shifts. Players are very quickly rotated on and off the ice, usually in bursts of 30 to 40 seconds. Any shift that goes over a minute is pretty long, and the idea is we kind of have these guys move and rotate very quickly so that we consistently have the strongest, fastest, freshest legs on ice to be able to score. But if you see a stat generally where you're seeing a player that has like a large amount of time on ice, it means that they have been playing so much of the game, which means they're moving pretty intensely and sort of like carrying the game on their back, so to speak. And some of those stats are pretty fun to look at when we talk about the Admirals game in Boston and of course the Admirals game in Montreal. Now, some of this is really fun because basically the way that Scott and Kip's relationship works is almost this idea of hockey superstition and Scott finding his good luck charm. So he meets Kip, he's at the very low point of sort of his performance. The season has started off in a very rough way and he gets a smoothie from Kip and also a little bit of sunshine. From there, he wins a home game and that's very exciting and kind of gives him this idea that maybe this is his good luck charm. But then he goes on the road where he's not able to get the smoothie and loses to Boston. We get our funny chirp from Ilya, which is the only moment we get to see him in this episode. And then we go to the next game in Montreal where Scott gets beat again, no smoothie. And we know it's a bad loss if we pay attention to some of those stats that we saw earlier on. This game at Montreal ends up 1-5, which is a pretty rough situation. And you can also see that they had 21 shots on goal versus 37, which basically just means that Montreal absolutely was dominating them throughout the game. Then of course we get Shane's very innocent attempt to make a chirp and Scott coming at him with his deepest, darkest secret. I also loved this because, again, it felt like this additional moment when it comes to the TV show version of this story, where Scott is aware of everything that's going around him in a really strong way, or at least has some pretty strong suspicions. And I think part of that is because of how observant he has to be. We see the same thing in the way that he's sort of staking out his relationship with Kip, making sure that he understands, but he's 100% certain before he makes a move. And a lot of that observational talent would still be here when he's looking at other people interacting with each other, which is why that chirp cuts so deeply and why we also, of course, get this big fight between Shane and Scott. The other thing about this is that while fighting is allowed in hockey, the game was fully over. This was a full brawl that would have happened after the game clock ended, and there definitely would have been some fines thrown around after this game. There's something very funny to me about kind of getting Shane's cameo and seeing him do the only bad thing he seems to have ever done in his career, and also imagining sort of like the league punishment that he would have gotten. There definitely would have been fines thrown about for them. But of course, once Scott gets back into town and gets a smoothie again, his season and his performance really turns around. And as they're going through all of this and Kip and Scott's relationship is kind of blooming, we're seeing a lot of these little moments where there's a new superstition for Scott to have. And we see Kip kind of filling that good luck charm role. I love the way that their relationship sort of fits into the idea of a hockey superstition mold. Scott finds something that's working for him, it keeps his game going, and as long as he keeps his routine exactly the way he wants to keep it, he can continue performing to the best of his abilities. There's something really lovely about that. But that's also, of course, the thing that starts to break the camel's back when it comes to their relationship. One of the most heartbreaking parts about this episode is, of course, Scott's speech that he gives at the fundraiser, where we find out that not only is he an orphan and he's lost both of his parents, but that his relationship with hockey is very much kind of this savior situation. Hockey was not only his relationship with both of his parents, where both his mother and his father were hockey coaches, it's also the thing that sort of saved him after they passed away. Scott not only has this organization that he's trying to fundraise for that has kind of helped him throughout his life, but he also has a family that he's built out of hockey, which is the only family that he has. And the way that this episode is cut, we actually have Kip break up with Scott first. And even though when we're watching it, the speech itself comes after the breakup, that speech was visibly the thing that pushed Kip over the edge. And what struck me as you watch it, and especially the second time that I watched it, was that as Scott talks about how important this story is to him, Kip also realizes that he's never going to be able to part ways with hockey. And that Scott looks at his relationship with Kip as something that has to happen in secret until he's done with hockey. And while that might have been okay in some capacity, as Kip watches Scott talk about how important hockey is, there's also a space of knowing that he's never going to want to give that up. And he tests it with this sort of invitation to come to his birthday party and just to pretend to be friends. And he also sees that Scott can't do that. And I think that there's this space where it's like, maybe he never will be able to. What I think is very beautiful about the way that this relationship is portrayed and this episode is done is that even though it has to happen very quickly and that their relationship is really important as a catalyst for the main relationship we explore in this show of Shane and Ilya, their relationship is also very much wound up in the idea of hockey superstitions, of good performance. And hockey itself is very wrapped up in this idea of family and future and stability for Scott. And it's also the thing that keeps them from being able to create family, stability, and a future for Scott and Kip together. Where we see our sort of main leading characters in this show, Scott, Shane, and Ilya. All of them have a really specific relationship with hockey when it comes to the way they view themselves, when it comes to the way that they view their future, and when it comes to the way that they view their family. For Ilya, it's an escape. For Shane, it's something something that they bonded over and built together, and for Scott, it's something that gave him a family after he lost his. But also, for each of these three characters, hockey represents something that gets in the way of their future outside of hockey. For Shane and Ilya, it's about rivals and what would happen if their relationship ever became public. And it's also about competition and how that builds their relationship and ties the two of them together, whether romantically or professionally. But for Scott, it represents the only thing he's ever known, and a fear that if he goes after what he truly wants for himself, he'll lose the thing that's kept him whole all this time. The balance of hockey in Scott and Kip's relationship is really, really interesting and really, really well done. And I think every piece of it really forces the timeline faster, their relationship quicker, and also forces things to eventually suffocate and fall apart. I found it to be a really heartbreaking episode and also a really interesting kind of version of what life looks like when you're moving past the prime of your career. For Scott, new stars have already come into this league, and he doesn't necessarily believe that he has a Stanley Cup in him. So I think every moment that he has with hockey and how it's being kind of pushed up against every moment that he has with Kip is also a reminder that eventually he's going to need a future outside of hockey. But what does that look like, and how does he allow himself to have it when hockey is not only the thing that keeps him from being his true self, but also the only thing that helped raise him and make him who he is today? The nuance of hockey in Scott and Kip's relationship is so genuinely good, and there are so many little moments of Scott's relationship that you see that you wouldn't see in Shane and Ilya's because of the fact that Scott actually is having a downturn to his career, whereas we're seeing sort of hockey greatness in Shane and Ilya's storylines. I love the depiction of it. I loved how hockey really enriched their relationship. I also loved how the idea of their sort of meet cute and how their relationship starts to grow also directly influences Scott's ability to play hockey well and his winning streak. And then of course we see Scott still try to hold on to that good luck charm and that superstition in the Olympics medal game. I will say in my previous videos I talked a little bit about like the real life version of the Olympics at that time and the fact that it was the last year that we saw the NHL players go to the Olympics and that we didn't hear anything about the medals, but actually there is a tiny line at the very end of this episode that shows that I was wrong and I just wasn't listening closely enough. Carter Vaughn does say that this is the gold medal game, meaning that the USA is playing against, I believe, Canada at this point. So we do know that the medals are not the same as they were in the 2014 Olympics where the US actually placed 4th. And I wish I hadn't missed that on their first watch because there is something really fun about this hockey good luck charm continuing to work all the way to the Olympics even after their rough breakup, where Scott is still holding on to that relationship, holding on to those banana socks, and also of course holding Kip in his heart, where ultimately a gold medal eventually will lie on top of. So that takes us through Scott and Kip's relationship in episode 3, and it also takes us through a very different version of how hockey intertwines with romance in this show. I love the way they brought in an outsider in Kip and how a lot of that sort of reflects the audience's relationship with this show and with hockey, and also how hockey is not only the thing that pushes them together, but the thing that pulls them apart. Again, it's a similar theme that we see in Shane and Ilya's relationship, but done in a very different way. So hopefully you got a little bit more hockey context out of this. I really loved breaking down this relationship, and of course, I'm excited to break down the rest of the series. We still have episodes 4, 5, and 6 to get through. And boy, there's a lot of hockey that we have to talk about when we get through the kind of next era of Shane and Ilya's relationship. So if you've enjoyed this one, be sure to let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and of course, subscribe so that you don't miss the rest of the series.